Hunter Bridge. We'll be back home in another hour. I'm really sorry to see this trip end. We've been lucky with all our trips, but this one's been really something special. I knew Marty would like it. She's always been history happy. But what surprised me was the way the kids ate it up, and not just the fun deals. Funny how 4 kids can seem all alike until experiences like this come along. And then they react as though they'd come from 4 different families. You get a whole new insight. Even the twins, they're at the age right now where just picking their clothes up off the floor of their room is an effort too exhausting to be borne. But what they did in their first hour in Washington, well.
My friends, Virginia's 6th Congressional District. Washington, you know, is a living monument to those who have fought and are fighting and have died and are dying today for our freedom. Historic avenues lined with trees mark great moments in our heritage, provide access to some of the most stirring monuments in the memory of our nation. Massive buildings belonging to the people of America, all of the people of America, are the byways to every visit. This little film is a pictorial tour of the most beautiful city in the world, the capital of the United States of America. I wish that every American could visit his nation's capital. For those who have, I am sure this little film will stir some pleasant memories. And for those who plan to visit, this will perhaps help to guide you on your tour. For those of you who cannot make a personal visit, you will see a picture of some of the things you will miss. In our country, government is truly of, by, and for the people. And those who founded our nation decreed that government should be the servants of the people and not the people's master. The brick and mortar, which you see in Washington, does not belong to some impersonal, remote, detached entity called the government. These buildings, these monuments, these broad vistas and great parks belong to you, the people. And I hope that every citizen of our 6th Congressional District will be able to examine your property personally and soon. When you do visit your nation's capital, please be sure to come by our offices, which are located across Independence Avenue from the Capitol building. I will be pleased to make necessary arrangements for you to visit the galleries of the House of Representatives and the Senate of the United States, and indeed to assist in every way I can to make your trip to the nation's capital an enjoyable visit. Now let's join the family which is touring the nation's capital.
On a trip, I'm the corny type, I guess. Buy the guidebooks, take the tours, and so on. And one thing I do in any new place is head for the highest spot in town to see how it lays out. And that's where the twins did what they did, and whom they did it to was me.
Daddy, Mama can take the elevator. Let's us go up the stairs. What do you bet we can run all the way up without stopping? What's the matter, Daddy? Chicken?
The guidebook tells us there are 898 steps from the bottom to the top. This statement is true. But when you get to the top, when you look out, well, there it is. The mall, the Capitol, the enduring stateliness of everything. The beautiful broad river. All their lives, the kids will remember this as their city, which, they being Americans, it is. If George Washington was the strong father of his country, you might say Thomas Jefferson was its wise uncle, because it was largely he whose thoughts and words, commissioned by the Continental Congress in 1775, set the fledgling nation on the road to greatness.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men.
Nearby in the National Archives, guarded for our children and our children's children from every known hazard, is preserved the original Declaration of Independence, together with our Constitution and the Bill of Rights, on open view to we the people. To those who have lived their good lives under their protection, and those who still have their lives to live. All men are created equal. These being more than just words, our nation's progress and triumph has been tempered at times with struggle and heartbreak. And in the high company of the founders belongs the man born without advantage except equality of opportunity, a young rail splitter, become lawyer, become leader. Abraham Lincoln, this was the tired man who had to say, and this was the gaunt hand that wrote the enduring words.
87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth.
Along the history-washed banks of the Potomac, the past lives in and beside the present and the future. The White House was the first building begun in the new capital city in 1792. And Joey remembered from school that it actually wasn't called the White House then. It was a sandstone color until after the invading British burned it in the War of 1812. And it was painted white to cover the scars of the attack. The presidential family lives on the upper floors, with the first floor mostly the ceremonial rooms you see pictured in the guidebooks. In one of which, it's said, the first lady occupant hung out her wash in winter, but now more appropriately used for state receptions and balls and dinners. The presidential offices are in the two wings, with the Treasury building conveniently next door. Joey had his young mind made up. He was going to snap his own picture of the president. And sometimes that kid has the darndest luck. On the way back to the motel, we were held up by the traffic. And jackpot for Joey. It's hard to realize that the famous Pennsylvania Avenue was once unpaved mud, with the cast iron dome of the Capitol still cased in scaffolding. Now, of course, Washington is one of the most beautiful cities of our time. But more than that, as it's been written,
in every age there has been one city which has seemed the center of the world, which the fates have chosen to be a guardian for the hopes of all men, to hold and control their aspirations, to determine the probability of their glory or their regret, their happiness or their misery, their bondage or their freedom. That world city in our time is Washington.
The founding fathers expected that one day would come sailing up the broad and deep Potomac, great fleets of ocean-borne commerce, that the heavy-laden ships would meet here the main coastal highways from north and south, with someday a far-flung canal system bringing goods to the port from the western territories, and that the new capital would grow into one of the world's great commercial cities. In fact, Georgetown and downriver Alexandria, which were busy tobacco ports, long before Washington was even a gleam in L'Enfant's eye, were once memorialized by the Virginia Assembly to bestir themselves, lest a pushy little seaport to the north catch up to them and maybe even get ahead. New York, that was. In the 1830s, the canal was built, but when the Civil War began, the Potomac became the divider between brothers to the south and north, and a principal theater of war. Each side struggling to capture the river, the B&O Railway to the interior, and the canal. Today, the old canal's boats have been captured by tourists like us. And it's a wonderful ride all the way from Georgetown to the river's head of navigation, some 15 miles west of Washington, the roaring great falls of the Potomac, where the river breaks out of the Appalachian Highlands into the coastal plains with some of the wildest white water in America. There's so very much to see and do in Washington that you welcome an occasional interlude of calm and serenity. Well, anyway, the parents do. While the kids ride horses or head for the zoo, and for that, it's Rock Creek Park, a quiet wooded valley that winds through almost the middle of the bustling city. Even the ancient flour mill has decided to give up the old grind. And if Marty wonders where's Joey, it figures. Okay, chum, but if you get your clothes soaked, you'll miss the ball game tonight. There's a very wide choice of places to stay in Washington, from the fine conventional hotels like the Statler to the new, in the middle of everything, motel hotels, air-conditioned inside and water-conditioned outside. Wonderful for tired blood, not his, mine. And not bad for tired eyes. And, of course, there are the close-in highway motels. This trip we splurged, but next time we're going to bring our gear and try one of the campgrounds that seem to be on all the routes. Well, Joey didn't fall in Rock Creek, and he did get to root for the Senators. He's the demon of the sandlots back home, and, of course, his first big league game, especially the homer with one on and two away and the local fans going out of their minds. He was a lucky kid. And lucky me that I was with him when it happened. The next morning, we split up. Marty and the twins went out for the finer things in life, such as shopping, and the less cultural group dug out for its kind of attraction. First, back to Rock Creek Park for the zoo, the National Zoological Park, to be strict about it. 2,400 different exhibits. Name it, they've got it. A sort of Senator Noah's Ark. And travel really is broadening, I guess. For conclusive proof, where else in the world would I see a muncher like Joni giving peanuts away? High on the list of any red-blooded TV watcher is the FBI. Academically, I realize that the Department of Justice probably carries on certain other activities, but what my brood wanted to see were items like the real-life crime lab with vital clues bubbling in the test tubes, and the agents down in the basement firing range. These men are highly educated. Hold it a second. These men are highly educated, often scientists, attorneys, or accountants. But obviously, they're also trained in the practical arts of capture and survival. There's a solid moral in this target. If you must go wrong, don't cross a state line. Meanwhile, the more intellectual side of the family had done its own type of exploring. Marty paints a little, and the National Gallery of Art has one of the world's great collections of sculpture and paintings by the great masters of all the important schools from the 13th to the 19th century. A wireless earphone brings the guide lecture to those who want it without disturbing the serious artists and students. At the Library of Congress, with its 41 million separate items in 36 acres of floor space, Marty discovered one of the 3 surviving original Gutenberg Bibles, dating from before the time of Columbus, the birth of volume production printing for a knowledge-hungry world. This was the first use of movable type, and what that led to. And finally, the must for all people of culture, for students of literature and people like us who just happen to like Shakespeare. The Folger Library. There's a beautiful little model of London's original Globe Theatre. The drive-in of its period, you might say, because Shakespeare in his own time was popular entertainment. And it contains about everything Shakespearean you can think of, except the bard himself in a guide's uniform. And maybe it has the uniform. Comes midday, there's one bond shared by everyone in this center of culture and government, by diplomats, workers, and tourists alike: lunch. And since Washington's people have all kinds of incomes and tastes, there are all scales of eating places. Of course, for my brood, it's not whether, it's how you want your hamburger. After paying the lunch checks for a hungry family, what's more reassuring than to see somebody making money? Preferably a lot of it. So, who makes the most? This is naturally one of Washington's most provocative sights. But despite our national philosophy of free enterprise, it wouldn't be easy to start a business of one's own like this. For one thing, they use very special papers and special inks blended here at the Bureau, which they make sure are very hard to come by. However, at this point in the process, my alert twins wondered if you could perhaps get these bills at half price if you put in your order before they're printed on the other side. And Joey figured maybe they're making Texas-sized money, with what's left over being cut up into regular-sized bills for the common people. At last, a machine that can count it faster than my family can spend it. Among the functions of the 50-building complex known as the United States Naval Observatory is keeping track of what time it is, because a surprising number of modern-day activities are dependent upon knowing the exact instant of time. Exact, that is, to the microsecond. To this end and others, the Naval Observatory is one of the foremost astronomical workshops of the world. And while both the 12-inch and 26-inch telescopes, balanced as delicately as a fine watch, are mostly used for photographing the eternally changing heavens, visitors are not only permitted, but welcomed. Now, here's my idea of a museum, the Smithsonian Institution. Not institute, by the way, institution. They're very particular about that. It's also known as America's Attic because of the diversity of the 51 million items stored in its several buildings. Though the best-known exhibits probably are those from the fields of engineering and industry. A prime attraction is this moth-like little plane that was the first to fly solo across the Atlantic the year I was born, piloted by Charles Lindbergh at the then breathtaking speed of about 100 miles per hour. And near it, another pioneering vehicle, Alan Shepard's space capsule, which traveled literally out of this world 1,000 times as fast. I wonder what changes Joey will see in his lifetime. There are working models here of an infinity of things mechanical. And in the mind of everybody who goes through here, old and young, is the same thought. Someday he'll come back here when he can spend a week, or 2, or 3. At the Historical Wax Museum, history takes on personality. All sorts of significant personages from America's past are here, reproduced with sometimes startling fidelity. There's Mark Twain, proving that the rocking chair is no new thing. There are Jefferson Davis and Stonewall Jackson, Dr. Einstein, Lafayette visiting Washington. There's Lee's surrender to General Grant, and the unforgettable event which followed it so tragically soon. Signing a faithful replica of the Declaration of Independence between Benjamin Franklin, a souvenir of your trip to take back to school, or the Rotary Club. One odd item our kids are taking back to their Sunday school class is a tall tale about a real mosque. The Islamic Center, the only mosque in the United States, built in accordance with Muslim custom to face faraway Mecca. And their tall tale is of having to take their shoes off before going to church. Not far from the mosque, as befits the city's cosmopolitan character, is the great Gothic pile of Washington Cathedral, one of the 6 largest churches in the world, which has been building for 50 years. And each of the stained glass windows which light its eternally peaceful interior tells its own inspiring story of ageless faith and love. Contributing their special flavor to the cosmopolitan feeling of the city are the foreign embassies, with diplomats from nearby Canada to distant Tunisia. Diplomats from all over the world coming and going on their urgent affairs. The British alone maintain a staff of 600 people. We can expect continued activity from the Russians, with balancing activity of a more reassuring nature from a significantly larger Washington establishment, the Pentagon, the headquarters of all our military forces. We took the helicopter ride in 2 shifts, and it's a wonderful way to view the city. Marty was a little skittish at first, but she loved it after we came down.
You know some of the views I remember best? Our last day. On the boat trip down that beautiful Potomac to Mount Vernon. Funny, I hadn't looked forward to the ride itself as anything so startling. But when we backed out into the channel and I saw how the girls were taking it, I realized this was the first time in their lives they'd ridden on a real boat. You know, anything bigger than the speedboats up at the lake. I did wish Jack had come along with us. Of course, we wanted to have the car to drive back from Mount Vernon.
Well, I wanted to spend a little time at Arlington anyway, for my own memories, and I wanted Joey to be with me, to begin to realize what war can mean. That each one of these stones represents some guy named Howard or Tony or Mike or Morris, alive and vital, who taught his kid brother to play catch and wore his good blue suit for graduation. My own brother might have been in this group if he'd made it across the black gravel beach at Iwo Jima. In bronze, these Marines stand 32 feet tall. And I'll bet Bud looked just about that big to those guys in the Iwo caves until they got him. To the tomb of the unknown soldier, every visiting dignitary comes under military escort to pay his formal respects. The one we saw was the head of one of the new African nations. And it's fine, all the pomp and ceremony. But I look on it not so much as a tomb, as a temple for every American who loves his country and is grateful to his fellows who've given their lives to preserve it through its long and glorious history.
Well, our trip down the river was an experience in a lesser way. It was fun, different too, of course. And it was one more experience for the girls' memory shells. They could see for themselves how in the early days, the river was sometimes the only road the southern farmers and planters could travel to ship their crops, to keep in touch with one another.
Mount Vernon is 16 miles down the Potomac from Washington on the Virginia shore. It was the home of George Washington from the time he was a young man. It's now a national shrine, fittingly stately and beautiful. But when it came alive to me was when Joey happened to call it a farm, because that's what it was to George Washington, a farm or a plantation, which he worked as such, and from which he and his family took their living. In the American fashion, Washington was a soldier only incidentally, the times when soldiers were needed, for 5 years in his 20s against the French and Indians, and then after 15 years as a peaceable planter, as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Incidentally, for 6 long years of the Revolution, he never once saw this beloved home. It was a gracious way of life. The pleasures were simple but satisfying. Music, good conversation after a long day and a good dinner. The companionship of friends from neighboring plantations in the distant towns. Good books. The extensive letter writing which kept the leaders of the colonies in touch with each other in those days before easy travel and rapid communications. And since there was so little in the way of outside entertainment, no radio, no TV, few books and magazines, there was a great deal of entertaining in the home. All the furnishings here are true antiques of the period, many of them actually owned and used by Martha Washington and her children and her husband when they lived here. And this is one room where you can be sure that George Washington slept here. But I'm still not sure the kids really realize that there was once a time when even the President of the United States had no electric lights, no running water, no bathroom, no oil heat, not even a stove, because his home was heated in winter by open fireplaces, and there his food was cooked. But one thing they did have, as Marty reminded me pointedly, was plenty of servants. Said Marty, imagine keeping all those pots and pans clean and shiny in a day of smoky wood fires. The kitchen, by the way, was in a separate outbuilding, and the food was carried across the yard to the main house, sort of like room service. And whereas today, when we want something, we go out and buy it, back then a farmer grew practically all his own vegetables, fruits, and meat, and was pretty much self-sufficient. With an estate of this size, often having its own spinning house, tailor shop, shoemaker shop, smokehouse, ice house, and of course, its stables. And the garage of the time, the coach house, with the Jeep of the day for short runs around the farm, and the horseflesh version of the limousine for occasions of note. It was a very gracious life. Well, time to go. And then a strange thing happened. As we stood there on the broad piazza, ready to leave, our feet on the very same flagstones on which George Washington himself and Martha had stood, our eyes looking down the same gentle slope toward the same broad river that their eyes had looked on so often. Suddenly, it was as though time had fallen away, and they were there with us, walking in the gentle afternoon across the broad lawns, talking, planning, hoping, living. All of us felt it, even little Joni. It was strange, and it was wonderful. Well, it's about over. In another few minutes, we'll pull in the driveway and herd 4 sleepy kids into the house, into a home. A home that might not be here, certainly wouldn't be as secure and as happy if it weren't for the great things we've looked on and the great men we've come to know these past few days. In an old phrase, but one with a new and deeper meaning to us now, our American heritage of freedom.
In every age, there has been one city which has seemed the center of the world. The city which the fates have chosen to be a guardian for the hopes of all men, to hold and control their aspirations, to determine the probability of their glory or their regret, their happiness or their misery, their bondage or their freedom. That world city in our time is Washington.